The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Buckingham Palace as Charles stood in the blue drawing room, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. At 75, he carried himself with the practiced dignity of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. Yet tonight something felt different. The weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical, seemed heavier than usual. "Your Majesty, the guests are beginning to arrive," his private secretary announced from the doorway, clipboard in hand. The state banquet for the visiting German chancellor was set to begin in an hour, and every detail had been meticulously planned for months. Charles nodded without turning around. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could see the lights of London twinkling in the distance. Somewhere out there, millions of his subjects were living their ordinary lives, unaware that their king was grappling with emotions he had buried for decades. The past year had been a whirlwind since his coronation. He had thrown himself into his royal duties with unprecedented vigor, determined to prove that his long wait for the throne had been worthwhile. Trade missions, state visits, charitable engagements. His calendar was packed from dawn to dusk. Yet in quiet moments like these, his thoughts invariably drifted to the same place they had for the past 27 years. Catherine Middleton had entered the royal family as a breath of fresh air. When William first brought her to family gatherings, Charles had been struck by her natural grace and genuine warmth. Unlike so many who sought proximity to the royals for personal gain, Kate seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention her relationship with the future king brought her. She would slip away from photographers, deflect praise, and focus instead on the people around her with an intensity that reminded Charles of someone he had once known very well. The resemblance wasn't physical. Kate's brunette locks and athletic build were nothing like Diana's blonde elegance. But there was something in the way she moved through a room, the way she knelt down to speak with children at eye level, the way she listened with her whole being when someone shared their struggles. It was a quality Charles had fallen in love with 30 years ago, and losing it had carved a hollow in his chest that never quite healed. Tonight's banquet would be particularly challenging. The German chancellor was bringing her husband, and several other political couples would be in attendance. Camilla would be at Charles's right side, fulfilling her role as queen consort with the competence she had developed over years of practice. She understood the protocols, knew when to speak and when to remain silent, and had earned the grudging respect of many who had initially viewed her as an interloper. But William and Kate would also be there, and Charles found himself both anticipating and dreading their presence. Over the years, he had developed an easy relationship with his daughter-in-law. She called him Grandpa Wales when the children were around, and her genuine affection for his grandchildren had created a bridge between them that felt natural and unforced. Yet lately, Charles had noticed something shifting in their interactions. Perhaps it was the stress of his new role as king, or maybe it was simply the inevitable loneliness that came with absolute power. But he found himself paying closer attention to Kate's presence in ways that made him uncomfortable. The way she laughed at William's jokes, her unconscious grace as she navigated royal protocols, the intelligence that shone in her eyes when she discussed the charitable causes closest to her heart. "Sir." The private secretary cleared his throat gently. Charles turned from the window, his reverie broken. "Yes, of course. Has the queen consort finished dressing?" "Yes, Your Majesty. She's in the green drawing room reviewing the seating arrangements one final time." The seating arrangements. Charles almost smiled at Camilla's attention to such details. She approached royal events like a general planning a military campaign, considering every possible social dynamic and potential diplomatic pitfall. It was one of her strengths, this methodical preparation that had helped her navigate the treacherous waters of public opinion for decades. "And the Prince and Princess of Wales. They arrived 20 minutes ago, sir. Princess Catherine is with the children in the nursery, saying good night." The image of Kate tucking in George, Charlotte, and Louis brought an unexpected pang to Charles's chest. Diana had done the same thing with William and Harry, stealing precious moments with them between official duties. He had missed so many of those intimate family scenes, called away by duty or simply too awkward to intrude on what seemed like naturally feminine territory. With Kate, however, he had found opportunities to be more present. When the Cambridge family visited Highgrove, he would often find excuses to wander past the nursery during bedtime routines. Kate never made him feel like an intruder. Instead, she would invite him in, encouraging George to show his grandfather a drawing or asking Charlotte to demonstrate a new dance she had learned. Those moments felt like gifts, glimpses into the warm family life that had largely eluded him during his own children's youth. Shall I escort you to the reception, Your Majesty? Charles straightened his shoulders and checked his reflection in the ornate mirror hanging near the window. The face looking back at him was dignified but tired, marked by decades of public service and personal disappointment. His hair, now completely gray, was perfectly styled. His evening dress was immaculate. To any observer, he looked every inch the monarch he had been born to become. In a moment, Charles said, "I'd like to stop by the nursery first." The private secretary made a note on his clipboard, but said nothing. Charles's devotion to his grandchildren was well known throughout the palace staff, and small deviations from the schedule were often accommodated when they involved the little ones. The walk to the nursery took Charles through several of the palace's most magnificent rooms. Portraits of his ancestors gazed down at him from gilded frames. Kings and queens who had navigated their own complex personal relationships while serving the crown. How many of them had struggled with the tension between duty and desire? How many had loved people they couldn't have, or found themselves drawn to connections that challenged everything they thought they knew about themselves? The nursery was on the second floor, in a wing that had been converted to more modern family quarters. As Charles approached, he could hear Kate's voice through the partially open door, reading a story in the animated tones that delighted children. He paused in the hallway, listening. And then, the dragon realized that what he really needed wasn't treasure or a bigger cave, but friends who understood him, Kate was saying. Sometimes the things we think will make us happy aren't what we actually need. Through the crack in the door, Charles could see her sitting on the edge of George's bed, the book balanced on her lap. She had changed from her afternoon clothes into an elegant navy gown for the evening's festivities, but she had kicked off her heels and tucked her feet under her like a teenager. Charlotte was curled up beside her, thumb in her mouth, while Louis sprawled across the foot of the bed in his pajamas. "Mummy, do you think Papa has dragon friends?" George asked seriously. Kate's laugh was like music. "I think Papa has many different kinds of friends. Some are dragons, some are knights, and some are regular people who just care about him very much." "What about Grandpa King?" Charlotte mumbled around her thumb. Charles held his breath, curious about Kate's response. "Grandpa King has the most friends of all," Kate said softly. "The whole kingdom is his friend, even when they don't always agree with him. That's what makes him such a good king." The simple sincerity of her answer hit Charles harder than he expected. Here was this woman, who had married into the most scrutinized family in the world, defending him to his grandchildren with genuine warmth. She could have easily deflected the question or given a more politically neutral response, but instead she had chosen kindness. "Your Majesty?" Charles turned to find William approaching down the hallway, also dressed for the evening in white tie and tails. His eldest son had inherited Diana's height and coloring, but his demeanor was pure Windsor, controlled, dutiful, occasionally rigid. "I was hoping to say good night to the children," Charles said, suddenly, feeling like he needed to justify his presence. William's expression softened. "Of course. Kate will be delighted to see you. She was just saying earlier that George has been asking when you might visit Anmer Hall again." The two men entered the nursery together, and Kate looked up with a genuine smile that made Charles's chest tighten inexplicably. "Grandpa King," Charlotte squealed, launching herself from the bed into Charles's arms. He caught her easily, breathing in the sweet scent of her freshly washed hair. "Hello, my darling. Have you been good for Mummy? She taught me to curtsy properly today," Charlotte announced proudly. "Want to see?" Kate stood gracefully, smoothing her skirt. "Perhaps Grandpa King would like to see it tomorrow, sweetheart. Right now, we need to let him get ready for his very important dinner." "Can we come to the important dinner?" Louis asked hopefully. "When you're older," William said, ruffling his youngest son's hair. "For now, you have the very important job of sleeping well, so you can play in the garden tomorrow." Charles found himself studying the family dynamics as they played out around him. William and Kate moved together with the easy coordination of partners who truly knew each other. When Kate went to tuck Louis back into his bed, William automatically stepped closer to support Charlotte's weight in Charles's arms. When William bent to kiss George goodnight, Kate placed her hand briefly on his back in a gesture so natural it was clearly unconscious. Watching them, Charles felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride in his son's obvious happiness, joy in his grandchildren's security and confidence. But underneath those positive feelings was something darker and more troubling, a longing for the kind of partnership he observed between William and Kate. His marriage to Camilla was comfortable, built on decades of shared history and mutual understanding. They were genuinely fond of each other, and She had proven herself capable of rising to the challenges of royal life. But their relationship lacked the spark, the easy intimacy he witnessed between his son and daughter-in-law. "We should head down," Kate said, after the children were settled. "I know Chancellor Merkel doesn't like to be kept waiting." As they prepared to leave the nursery, Charles found himself walking beside Kate, while William lingered for a final word with George. "They're lucky to have you," Charles said quietly. Kate glanced at him with surprise. "I'm the lucky one, Your Majesty. This family has given me more than I ever dreamed possible." Her sincerity was unmistakable, and Charles felt something shift inside him. For years, he had told himself that his increased attention to Kate was simply familial affection, a father-in-law's appreciation for the woman who made his son happy. But, standing beside her in the dim hallway, breathing in her subtle perfume, and feeling the warmth of her presence, he was forced to acknowledge a truth he had been avoiding. Somewhere along the way, his feelings for Catherine had evolved beyond what was appropriate or safe. The realization should have horrified him, but instead it brought an odd sense of relief. At least now he could name what had been troubling him for months. The question was what to do about it. The state banquet unfolded with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. Charles moved through the evening's rituals on autopilot, greeting Chancellor Merkel and her husband, making small talk with ambassadors, delivering his prepared remarks about Anglo-German cooperation. But, throughout it all, he found his attention repeatedly drawn to Kate. She was seated several places down from him at the head table, between a German industrialist and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Even from a distance, Charles could see her working her particular magic. The industrialist, a stern-faced man in his 60s who had seemed bored during the pre-dinner reception, was now leaning forward with obvious interest as Kate spoke. The Archbishop, normally reserved to the point of stuffiness, was actually smiling. "She's quite remarkable, isn't she?" Charles turned to find Camilla watching him with an unreadable expression. His wife had always been perceptive about people's motivations and feelings, a skill that had served her well during her long journey from royal mistress to queen consort. "Who?" Charles asked, though they both knew the answer. "Catherine. The way she connects with people. It's a gift, really." Camilla's tone was neutral, but her eyes remained fixed on Charles's face. Diana had it too, of course. That ability to make everyone feel like they're the most important person in the room. The comparison to Diana was not accidental. Camilla rarely mentioned Charles's first wife directly, but when she did, it was always with purpose. Charles felt a familiar tightness in his chest at the mention of Diana's name, complicated now by his growing awareness of the parallels between his late wife and his daughter-in-law. "Catherine has certainly grown into her role admirably," Charles said carefully. Camilla nodded and turned back to her own dinner companion. But Charles sensed the conversation was far from over. His wife had an almost supernatural ability to read between the lines of human behavior, and he had probably been less subtle about his interest in Kate than he realized. The dinner continued for another hour, filled with the usual diplomatic pleasantries and carefully rehearsed toasts. Charles delivered his speech about the importance of international cooperation, while Chancellor Merkel responded with remarks about shared values and historical ties. The guests applauded at appropriate moments, the wine flowed freely, and everything proceeded exactly as planned. It wasn't until the reception afterward that things began to unravel. The guests had moved to the picture gallery for drinks and informal conversation. Charles was engaged in a discussion about climate policy with several EU ministers when he noticed Kate standing alone near one of the tall windows, looking out at the illuminated gardens. She had a champagne flute in her hand, but hadn't touched it, and there was something in her posture that suggested she was lost in thought. Without really making a conscious decision, Charles excused himself from the policy discussion and made his way across the room. Several guests tried to intercept him along the way, but he deflected their attempts at conversation with polite but firm efficiency. "Hiding from the crowd?" he asked as he approached Kate. She turned with a start, then smiled. "Just taking a moment to breathe. These events can be a bit overwhelming sometimes. Even after all these years. Especially after all these years. I think I've gotten better at performing the role, but it still feels like performing sometimes. Does that ever go away?" Her honesty surprised him. Most people, even close family members, didn't admit to finding royal duties burdensome. They maintained the fiction that serving the crown was pure privilege and joy. "I'm 75, and I still feel like I'm acting some days," Charles admitted. "The secret is remembering that everyone else is acting too, in their own way." Kate laughed softly. "That's actually quite comforting." I sometimes worry that I'm the only one who feels like an imposter. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the guests mingle in the ornate room. Charles was acutely aware of Kate's presence beside him, the way she held herself, the subtle scent of her perfume, the way the light from the chandeliers caught the highlights in her hair. "Your Majesty," she said eventually, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever miss having someone who really knows you? I don't mean the royal you, but the actual person underneath all of this." She gestured vaguely at the opulent surroundings. The question was so unexpected and so precisely what Charles had been thinking about that he almost gasped. Instead, he found himself answering with more honesty than he had intended. "Every day," he said quietly. "The higher you rise, the lonelier it becomes. Everyone wants something from you, or they're afraid to be themselves around you. Genuine connection becomes—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Precious." Kate nodded slowly. "William tries to understand, and he does better than most people would. But he was born into this. He doesn't remember what it was like to be normal, to have anonymous friendships and spontaneous conversations with strangers. Sometimes I feel like I'm losing pieces of myself." Charles turned to look at her more directly. In profile, she was breathtakingly beautiful, but it wasn't her physical appearance that drew him. It was this vulnerability, this intellectual and emotional depth that most people never got to see. "I felt the same way when I was younger," he said. "The trick is finding people who can see past the title. They're rare, but they exist. Have you found many?" "A few. Over the years." He paused. "You're one of them, actually." Kate looked up at him with surprise. "What do you mean? When you look at me, you don't see the king first. You see Charles, who happens to be a grandfather, who worries about his children, who gets excited about organic farming, and probably talks too much about architecture. You see the person." Something shifted in Kate's expression. For a moment, the formal distance that usually existed between them seemed to dissolve entirely. They were just two people, standing in a beautiful room, having an honest conversation about loneliness and connection. "Charles," she said softly, using his name without his title for the first time he could remember. The single word hung between them, loaded with possibility and danger. Charles felt his heart rate increase as he realized they had crossed into territory that was far too intimate for a father-in-law and daughter-in-law, regardless of how lonely they both might be. "Catherine," he replied, matching her tone. They were standing closer now, though neither could have said who had moved first. Close enough that Charles could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "This is—" Kate began, then stopped. "Complicated," Charles finished. "Dangerous." "Yes." Neither of them moved away. "Charles, there you are." William's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "The Chancellor was asking about your views on the Northern Ireland Protocol." Charles and Kate stepped apart smoothly, both turning toward William with expressions of polite attention. To any observer, it would have looked like a perfectly innocent conversation between family members. But Charles could see something in his son's eyes, not suspicion exactly, but awareness. William was nobody's fool, and he knew his wife well enough to recognize when she was affected by something. "Of course," Charles said evenly. "I was just telling Catherine how much I appreciate her insights on these diplomatic occasions. She has a remarkable ability to put people at ease." William's smile was warm, but didn't quite reach his eyes. "She does indeed. Darling, Lady Pemberton was looking for you. Something about the Children's Charity Gala next month." It was a clear dismissal, delivered with princely authority despite the casual tone. Kate understood immediately. "Of course, Your Majesty, thank you for the conversation. It was enlightening." She moved away gracefully, stopping to speak with Lady Pemberton on the far side of the room. Charles watched her go, acutely conscious of William's presence beside him. "Everything all right, Papa?" William asked quietly. The question was layered with meaning. William wasn't just asking about the evening or the diplomatic proceedings. He was asking about whatever had just happened between Charles and his wife. "Of course," Charles replied. "Why wouldn't it be?" William studied his father's face for a long moment. "No reason. It's just—" Kate seemed a bit emotional tonight. "I wanted to make sure no one had said anything to upset her." The protective instinct in William's voice was unmistakable. Here was a man who would do anything to shield his wife from harm, including harm that might come from within his own family. "She mentioned feeling the strain of public life sometimes," Charles said carefully. "I was trying to reassure her that such feelings are normal." "Oh." William's expression relaxed slightly. "That's kind of you. She does worry sometimes about whether she's measuring up." I keep telling her she's the best thing that's ever happened to this family, but she has trouble believing it. The comment hit Charles like a physical blow. William clearly adored his wife, viewed her as a treasure to be protected and cherished. The idea that his own father might be developing feelings for her would be not just shocking, but deeply betraying. She's been a wonderful addition to the family, Charles managed. The best, William agreed. I honestly don't know what I'd do without her. They stood together watching Kate chat animatedly with Lady Pemberton and several other guests. She had recovered her composure completely, giving no sign that anything unusual had just occurred. Her ability to compartmentalize and maintain her public facade was impressive, but it also made Charles wonder how many other complicated emotions she kept carefully hidden. I should probably rescue her from Lady Pemberton, William said after a few minutes. That woman can talk for hours about fundraising strategies. As William walked away to collect his wife, Charles remained by the window, ostensibly watching the interaction, but actually trying to process what had just happened. In the span of a 10-minute conversation, he had crossed several lines he hadn't even known he was approaching. He had admitted to Kate that he found her special, had used her first name in a tone that suggested intimacy, had allowed himself to get close enough to her that anyone observing might have questioned their relationship. Most dangerously of all, he had felt her respond to his attention in a way that suggested his feelings might not be entirely one-sided. The implications were staggering. If his growing attachment to Kate became known, it could destroy his relationship with William, devastate his marriage to Camilla, and create a scandal that would rock the monarchy. The British press would have a field day with the story of a king infatuated with his daughter-in-law. The comparisons to Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson would be inevitable and damaging. But even knowing all of that, Charles couldn't bring himself to regret the conversation. For 10 minutes, he had felt truly seen and understood by another person. Kate had shared her vulnerabilities with him, had looked at him with warmth and recognition, had called him by his name in a way that acknowledged the man beneath the crown. It was the most alive he had felt in years. Quite a successful evening, don't you think? Camilla appeared at his elbow, champagne flute in hand. She had been working the room methodically all evening, fulfilling her role as hostess with practiced efficiency. Yes, very successful, Charles agreed. The Chancellor seemed pleased. And I thought Catherine handled herself particularly well tonight. She's really grown into her role. Again, Charles sensed layers beneath Camilla's seemingly innocent comments. His wife was far too intelligent and observant to have missed the extended conversation between Charles and Kate, or the way they had been standing when William interrupted. She has indeed, Charles said neutrally. Camilla nodded and took a sip of her champagne. It's lovely when families can support each other through difficult times, don't you think? Everyone needs someone who truly understands their struggles. The message was clear. Camilla knew something was happening, and she was warning him to be careful. Whether her concern was for the family's reputation, for William and Kate's marriage, or for her own position as queen consort, Charles couldn't tell. But the warning was unmistakable. Indeed, Charles replied. Family support is essential. They stood together in silence, watching the party wind down around them. Guests were beginning to take their leave, bowing and curtsying their way out of the room. Soon, the evening would be over, and Charles would return to his private quarters to contemplate the dangerous new territory his emotions had led him into. But first, he would have to say goodnight to William, and Kate would have to look his son in the eye and his daughter-in-law in the face, and pretend that everything was exactly as it had always been. The performance was about to become much more challenging. 3 weeks after the German state banquet, Charles found himself unable to concentrate on the red boxes that arrived each morning filled with government papers requiring his attention. Cabinet minutes, Foreign Office briefings, and parliamentary reports sat unread on his desk while he stared out the window of his study at Clarence House, thinking about things that had no place in a monarch's mind. His private secretary had knocked twice already, reminding him of upcoming appointments, but Charles had waved him away both times. Today marked the anniversary of Diana's death, a date that had become easier to bear in recent years, but now felt weighted with new significance. The parallels between Diana and Kate had become impossible to ignore. Both women had entered the royal family as outsiders. Both possessed an innate ability to connect with people across all social boundaries, and both had struggled with the constraints and expectations of royal life. But there was something else, something Charles was only beginning to understand. He had fallen in love with Diana when she was 19, drawn to her freshness and vulnerability. She had looked at him with such adoration in those early days, as if he could solve all her problems simply by loving her. It had been intoxicating to be seen that way, to feel needed and valued not for his position, but for himself. With Kate, the dynamic was entirely different, but somehow more compelling. She was a mature woman who had chosen royal life with full awareness of its costs. When she looked at him with understanding and empathy, it wasn't the desperate need of a teenager, but the recognition of one adult who saw another clearly. She didn't need him to rescue her. Instead, she offered him something he had never expected to find again: intellectual and emotional partnership. A soft knock at the door interrupted his reverie. "Come in," he called, expecting to see his secretary again. Instead, Kate appeared in the doorway, elegant in a navy suit that emphasized her tall, graceful frame. "Your Majesty, I hope I'm not interrupting. William is meeting with the Duchy of Cornwall management team, and I thought—" She trailed off, clearly uncertain about her reception. Since the state banquet, they had seen each other only at formal family gatherings where meaningful conversation was impossible. "Catherine," Charles said, rising from his desk. "Please, come in. I was just thinking." She stepped into the study, her eyes taking in the papers scattered across his desk and the obvious signs of distraction. "Difficult decisions?" "Something like that." Charles gestured toward the sitting area near the fireplace. "Please sit. Can I offer you tea?" "That would be lovely, thank you." Charles pressed the bell to summon his valet, then joined Kate on the sofa. They sat with careful distance between them, but Charles was acutely aware of her presence. "How are the children?" he asked, falling back on safe family territory. "Growing too fast. George is becoming quite serious about his cricket, and Charlotte has decided she wants to learn French. Louis is still convinced he can fly if he jumps off high enough furniture." Charles smiled at the image. William was the same at that age. Gave us quite a few scares with his aerial experiments. Did Diana worry constantly, or am I being overprotective? The question was casual, but Charles sensed deeper currents beneath it. Kate rarely asked about Diana directly, understanding the complexity of emotions her name evoked. Diana worried about everything, Charles said honestly. She was barely older than William is now when he was born. I think she felt the weight of responsibility very keenly. It must have been difficult, being so young and suddenly having the whole world watching your every move as a mother. It was. I'm afraid I wasn't as supportive as I should have been. I was still learning how to be a husband, let alone understanding how to help someone navigate royal motherhood. Kate studied his face carefully. You were young too, and you didn't exactly have a roadmap for any of it. Her generosity struck him forcefully. Most people, when discussing the failure of his first marriage, focused on his perceived shortcomings or his relationship with Camilla. Kate was perhaps the first person to acknowledge that he had been struggling too, trying to figure out impossible dynamics without guidance. The tea arrived, providing a temporary distraction as Charles poured for both of them. Kate accepted her cup gracefully, her fingers brushing his briefly as she took it from him. The contact was electric, and from the way she stilled for a moment, Charles suspected she felt it too. Your Majesty, she said after a few sips of tea. I wanted to thank you for our conversation a few weeks ago. What you said about feeling like an imposter sometimes, it helped more than you know. Did it? Yes. I went home that night and talked to William about some of the things I'd been feeling. He was wonderfully understanding, but I realized that sharing those feelings with someone who has experienced them from the inside was different. More complete somehow. Charles set down his teacup, his heart beginning to race. I'm glad I could help. I've found that this life can be quite isolating if you don't have people who understand the particular pressures. Do you have enough people like that? People who really see you. The question was quietly asked, but it cut straight to the heart of Charles's loneliness. He considered deflecting, giving the safe answer that would preserve appropriate boundaries between them. Instead, he found himself being honest again. Not really. Camilla understands the public aspects of royal life, but she came to it later in life. She doesn't know what it's like to have your entire identity shaped by duty from childhood. And my children. He paused, choosing his words carefully. William and Harry grew up in this world, but they see me primarily as their father. It's difficult for them to separate the man from the monarch. That must be lonely. It is. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of his admission hanging between them. Charles found himself studying Kate's profile as she gazed into the fireplace. There was something timeless about her beauty, classical in a way that would photograph well decades from now when she was older and her role in the royal family had evolved. Catherine, he said eventually. Can I ask you something? She turned to look at him directly. Of course. When you look at me, what do you see? The question was more intimate than anything he had asked her before, and he saw her recognize the significance of it. She could have deflected with humor or given a diplomatic answer about seeing a devoted grandfather and dedicated king. Instead, she was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering her response carefully. I see someone who has carried an enormous burden for his entire life with more grace than anyone should be expected to have, she said finally. I see intelligence and passion that you're not always allowed to express fully. I see someone who cares deeply about things that matter, the environment, architecture, farming, social justice, but who has to be careful about advocating too strongly for fear of appearing political. She paused, then continued more softly. I see someone who has made mistakes and learned from them, who has been criticized unfairly and taken it with dignity. I see loneliness that you try to hide and kindness that you don't get enough credit for. Charles felt something break open in his chest. No one had ever described him that way, not with such clear-eyed understanding of both his strengths and vulnerabilities. And, Kate added, her voice barely above a whisper, I see someone who makes me feel understood in a way that's probably dangerous for both of us. The admission hung in the air between them like a living thing. Charles felt his breathing quicken as the implications of what she had said registered fully. She was acknowledging that whatever was happening between them was mutual, that she felt the same dangerous pull he had been fighting for months. Catherine, he began, not sure what he intended to say. I know, she said quickly. I know all the reasons why this is impossible. You're married to Camilla, who has been nothing but kind to me. You're William's father, and he trusts you completely. I have 3 children who depend on the stability of their family. The monarchy itself could be damaged if... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. But, Charles prompted gently. But, I can't seem to stop thinking about you. About our conversations. About the way you look at me sometimes when you think no one is watching. About what it might be like if circumstances were different. Charles set down his teacup and moved closer to her on the sofa. Not touching, but close enough that he could see the pulse beating in her throat, could smell the subtle floral scent of her perfume. If circumstances were different, he said carefully, what, then? Kate met his gaze directly. Then, I would tell you that I think about you far more than I should. That when you use my name instead of my title, it does things to me that aren't appropriate. That the loneliness you described, I feel it too, even though I'm surrounded by people who love me. And, I would tell you, Charles replied, his voice rougher than usual, that you have become the brightest part of my days. That your intelligence and compassion and strength make me remember what it feels like to be fully alive. That I have been fighting feelings for you that go far beyond what a father-in-law should feel. They were leaning toward each other now, drawn by a magnetic pull that felt stronger than either of their intentions. Charles could see his own desire reflected in Kate's eyes, could feel the electric tension building between them. This is madness, Kate whispered. Complete madness, Charles agreed, but he didn't pull away. If anyone found out, I know, William would never forgive either of us. I know, your reign could be destroyed. I know, despite listing all the rational reasons to stop, neither of them moved away. They sat frozen in the moment, both aware they were standing at the edge of a precipice that would change everything. What do we do? Kate asked finally. Charles reached out slowly and touched her face, his palm cupping her cheek. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing for a moment. I don't know, he admitted. I've never felt anything like this before. With Diana, it was passion and youth and the excitement of breaking rules. With Camilla, it was comfort and familiarity and shared history. But this is different, Kate finished. This feels like coming home to a place I've never been. Kate's breath caught at his words. She opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression so tender it made his chest ache. Charles, she said, and the way she spoke his name was like a prayer. He leaned closer, close enough that their foreheads were almost touching, close enough that he could feel her breath on his skin. Tell me to stop, he whispered. Tell me this is wrong, and that we should forget this conversation ever happened. Kate was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. I can't, she said finally. I can't tell you to stop, because I don't want you to. The admission shattered the last of Charles's resistance. Before he could think about consequences or propriety or the dozen reasons why this was the worst possible idea, he closed the remaining distance between them and kissed her. It was gentle at first, almost tentative, as if they were both testing whether this was really happening. But when Kate responded, her lips soft and warm against his, the kiss deepened into something that felt like inevitability. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Charles rested his forehead against hers. "God help us both," he murmured. "What have we done?" Kate whispered. "Something that changes everything," Charles replied, and he knew it was true. There would be no going back from this moment. No pretending that their relationship was simply familial affection or mutual respect. They had crossed a line that transformed them from father-in-law and daughter-in-law into something far more dangerous and complicated. The sound of voices in the hallway outside the study made them spring apart, reality crashing back like a cold wave. They were both married, both parents, both members of a family that depended on discretion and propriety to maintain its position. Kate smoothed her hair and straightened her jacket, while Charles moved to the window and tried to compose his expression. When his secretary knocked and entered a moment later, they were sitting at opposite ends of the room, giving every appearance of having been engaged in perfectly innocent conversation. But everything had changed, and they both knew it. The question now was what they were going to do about it. The weeks following their kiss at Clarence's house passed in a haze of stolen glances and carefully maintained facades. Charles threw himself into his royal duties with renewed vigor, as if a packed schedule could somehow quiet the turmoil in his mind. He opened hospitals, attended charity galas, hosted foreign dignitaries, and conducted audiences with government ministers, all while fighting the constant urge to call Kate and arrange another private meeting. She seemed to be employing a similar strategy. The royal diary showed her maintaining an ambitious schedule of engagements, visiting schools, launching campaigns for children's mental health, attending art exhibitions. They moved in the same social circles, but rarely ended up at the same events, as if some invisible force were keeping them apart for their own protection. When they did encounter each other at family gatherings, their interactions were models of appropriate behavior. Kate addressed him as Your Majesty with perfect formality. Charles inquired politely about the children and her various charitable projects. To any observer, they appeared to be nothing more than cordial in-laws who respected each other but shared no particular intimacy. But beneath the surface, both of them were struggling with feelings that grew stronger rather than weaker with attempted suppression. Charles found himself lying awake at night, remembering the softness of Kate's lips and the way she had looked at him with such open vulnerability. He replayed their conversations over and over, analyzing every word and gesture for hidden meaning. The situation was made more complicated by Camilla's increasingly watchful presence. His wife had always been observant, but lately Charles felt as though she were studying his every move and reaction. She asked casual questions about his meetings and correspondence that felt more pointed than usual. She suggested joint engagements and social activities that would keep them together more often. "You seem distracted lately, darling," Camilla said one evening as they prepared for bed in their private quarters at Clarence's house. "Is everything all right with the government? You've been quite preoccupied." Charles paused in the act of removing his cufflinks. "Just the usual pressures. The Prime Minister is concerned about the economic forecasts, and there are several controversial pieces of legislation coming up." It was a plausible explanation, and not entirely untrue. But Charles could see in Camilla's expression that she wasn't entirely convinced. "Perhaps we should plan a quiet weekend at Highgrove," she suggested. "Just the two of us. We could invite the Parkers for dinner on Saturday. You always enjoy John's company." The prospect of an intimate weekend with Camilla, pretending everything was normal while his thoughts were consumed with another woman, filled Charles with dread. But refusing would only increase her suspicions. "That sounds lovely," he said with what he hoped was appropriate enthusiasm. Camilla smiled and kissed his cheek before disappearing into her dressing room. Charles stood alone in their bedroom, surrounded by the accumulated artifacts of their long relationship, photographs from holidays, books they had read together, small gifts exchanged over the years. This was his life, the partnership he had chosen after decades of longing. It was comfortable, stable, and built on genuine affection. So why did it suddenly feel like a prison? The answer came to him the following Tuesday, when he attended the opening of a new wing at the National Portrait Gallery. Kate was scheduled to be there as well, having served as patron of several art-related charities. They would be viewing the exhibition separately, maintaining their careful distance. But Charles found himself anticipating even the possibility of seeing her with an intensity that alarmed him. She arrived 20 minutes after he did, elegant in an emerald green dress that complemented her dark hair beautifully. Charles watched from across the gallery as she moved through the crowd, stopping to speak with artists and donors with the easy grace that had become her trademark. She was everything a modern royal should be: informed, engaged, genuinely interested in the people and causes she supported. Magnificent collection, isn't it, Your Majesty? Charles turned to find Sir David Attenborough at his elbow, the distinguished naturalist gesturing toward a portrait of Queen Victoria. Indeed, Charles replied, though he had been paying more attention to Kate than to the artwork. I was particularly struck by the contemporary pieces in the next room. The young artists they're featuring show remarkable promise. Lady Catherine was just telling me about her plans to establish a scholarship for disadvantaged students interested in the arts. At the mention of Kate's name, Charles felt his attention sharpen. Was she? Yes, quite passionate about it. She believes that artistic expression can be transformative for young people facing difficult circumstances. Reminds me of someone else I know who has always championed causes others might consider too idealistic. Sir David's comment was clearly meant as a compliment to Charles's own advocacy work over the years, but it also highlighted another parallel between him and Kate. They shared not just personal chemistry, but also a genuine commitment to using their positions to make a difference. Perhaps you'd like to hear more about her ideas? Sir David continued. I believe she's in the contemporary wing now. It was an innocent suggestion, but Charles felt his pulse quicken at the thought of seeking Kate out. Every rational part of his mind warned against it. They had agreed, without speaking of it directly, to maintain distance for everyone's safety. Deliberately arranging to be alone with her again would be incredibly foolish. That's a lovely thought, Charles said. But I should probably... Charles. Kate's voice cut across his excuse. She was approaching them with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Sir David, Your Majesty, what a pleasant surprise to find you discussing art together. Lady Catherine was just telling me about her scholarship initiative, Sir David explained. I thought His Majesty might be interested in hearing more about it. Kate's cheeks flushed slightly. It's still in the planning stages. I wouldn't want to bore anyone with preliminary ideas. On the contrary, Charles said, before he could stop himself. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. Perhaps we could discuss it privately for a few minutes? The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond scholarship programs. Kate's flush deepened, and she glanced around the crowded gallery as if assessing the wisdom of being seen in private conversation with him. Of course, she said finally. There's a quieter room just through here. Sir David beamed at what he perceived as a successful introduction, completely oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around him. Wonderful. I'll leave you to it then. Important work, supporting young artists. Charles and Kate made their way to a smaller exhibition room that was momentarily empty of other visitors. The space was intimate, with soft lighting and benches positioned to allow contemplation of the portraits lining the walls. We shouldn't be doing this, Kate said quietly once they were alone. I know, Charles replied, but he made no move to leave. They stood several feet apart, maintaining careful physical distance while the air between them crackled with tension. I've been thinking about you constantly, Kate admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. About what happened at Clarence's house. About what it means. And what do you think it means? Kate was quiet for a long moment, studying a portrait of a Victorian woman whose expression seemed to mirror her own internal conflict. I think it means I'm in love with you, she said finally. And I think that's going to destroy everything I care about. Charles felt the words hit him like physical blows. Hearing Kate acknowledge what they had both been feeling made it real in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Catherine, he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. Please, let me finish. I've been rehearsing this conversation in my mind for weeks, and if I don't say it now, I might lose my courage. Charles nodded, his heart hammering against his ribs. I love William, Kate continued. I love our children, our life together, the family we've built. He's a good man, and a good father, and he deserves better than a wife who dreams about his father. The blunt honesty of her words was like a knife to Charles's chest. But I can't seem to stop feeling what I feel for you. When you look at me, I feel seen in a way that has nothing to do with being the Princess of Wales or the future Queen Consort. You see Catherine Middleton, the person I was before all of this, and somehow that makes me feel more myself than I have in years. She turned from the portrait to look directly at him. I don't know what to do with that, she said. I don't know how to be in love with two men at the same time, especially when one of them is my husband and the other is his father. Charles closed the distance between them in 3 quick steps, stopping just short of touching her. Do you think I haven't been torturing myself with the same questions? He asked urgently. Do you think I don't know that what I feel for you could destroy my relationship with my son? That it makes a mockery of my marriage vows and my responsibilities as king? Kate's eyes filled with tears she was fighting not to shed. Then, what do we do? She whispered. Before Charles could answer, they heard voices in the corridor outside the exhibition room. Multiple people were approaching, their footsteps and conversation growing louder. Charles and Kate stepped apart quickly, both turning toward the portraits as if they had been engaged in nothing more significant than art appreciation. When a group of gallery donors entered the room a moment later, they found the king and the Princess of Wales maintaining perfect decorum. Your Majesty, Lady Catherine, how wonderful to see you both here, gushed Lady Pemberton, the same woman who had monopolized Kate's attention at the state banquet weeks earlier. For the next 20 minutes, they were surrounded by well-meaning art enthusiasts eager to share their thoughts on the exhibition. Charles and Kate played their roles perfectly, engaging with the conversation while maintaining appropriate distance from each other. But their earlier exchange had changed something fundamental between them. Kate had spoken the word love aloud, and Charles had responded with his own admission of torment. They were no longer dancing around their feelings or pretending their attraction was merely physical. They were two people desperately in love with each other, trapped in circumstances that made acting on those feelings impossible. When the gallery visit finally ended, they left separately without speaking privately again. But as Charles climbed into his official car for the ride back to Clarence's house, he knew their secret was becoming too large and dangerous to contain much longer. Something would have to give, and he was terrified of what that might mean for everyone involved. That evening, as he sat through dinner with Camilla and tried to make appropriate conversation about the day's events, Charles realized that the careful balance he had been trying to maintain was becoming untenable. His wife's increasingly pointed questions, William's occasional searching looks, Kate's obvious inner turmoil, all of it pointed toward an inevitable reckoning. The only question was whether that reckoning would come through their own choices or through discovery by others. As Charles lay in bed that night, listening to Camilla's steady breathing beside him, he found himself thinking about a line from Shakespeare that had always haunted him. The course of true love never did run smooth. He had thought he understood those words when he was young and struggling to navigate his feelings for Diana and Camilla simultaneously. But now, facing the prospect of destroying his family out of love for his daughter-in-law, he realized he had never truly comprehended the devastating truth of that observation. Love, when it struck at the wrong time and in the wrong circumstances, wasn't beautiful or romantic. It was a force of destruction that could tear apart everything you had worked to build. And Charles was powerless to stop it. The Children's Hospital Gala was meant to be a routine evening, one of dozens of charitable events that filled the royal calendar each year. The cause was important, the venue elegant, and the guest list carefully curated to include major donors and media representatives who would help publicize the hospital's work. Charles had attended similar functions hundreds of times over the decades, moving through the evening's rituals with practiced ease. But this gala was different because Kate would be there as the evening's keynote speaker. As patron of several children's charities, she had become a powerful advocate for pediatric mental health services, and her speech tonight was expected to announce a significant new initiative. Charles had tried to arrange his schedule to avoid the event, but his absence would have been too conspicuous. Both he and Kate were listed as honored guests, and the hospital's board had been planning for months around their participation. So here he was, standing in the ballroom of the Dorchester Hotel, watching Kate command the attention of 300 guests with the kind of speech that reminded everyone why she had become such an asset to the royal family. Too often, we think of children's mental health as a luxury concern, Kate was saying from the podium, her voice carrying clearly through the elegant space. Something to address after we've solved the more urgent problems of physical illness and educational achievement. But what we're learning is that mental wellness is the foundation upon which everything else is built. Charles found himself studying not just her words, but the way she delivered them, the slight pause she used for emphasis, the way she made eye contact with different sections of the audience, the passion that animated her expression when she discussed the children who had inspired the new program. This was Kate at her most formidable, using her platform to advocate for causes that genuinely mattered to her. She wasn't simply fulfilling royal obligations. She was leveraging her position to create real change. It was impossible not to be impressed, and Charles felt a surge of pride that was entirely inappropriate given their current circumstances. The new initiative we're launching tonight, Kate continued, will provide specialized support for children dealing with trauma, anxiety, and depression. But, more importantly, it will train teachers, parents, and community leaders to recognize the early signs of mental health struggles and respond with compassion rather than judgment. The applause that followed was enthusiastic and sustained. Charles joined in, keenly aware that several people in his vicinity were watching his reaction to his daughter-in-law's speech. When Kate finished speaking and made her way off the stage, Charles felt the familiar pull to seek her out, to tell her how moved he had been by her words. Instead, he forced himself to remain where he was, engaged in conversation with the hospital's chief executive about funding challenges. The reception that followed the speeches was the kind of elegant networking event that Charles could navigate in his sleep. He moved from group to group, discussing the hospital's work and encouraging continued support for the new mental health program. Several major donors approached him directly, seeking his endorsement for additional projects. It was during one of these conversations that disaster struck. Charles was speaking with Lord Morrison, a pharmaceutical executive who had pledged significant funding for the mental health initiative, when he noticed a commotion near the room's entrance. A photographer, not one of the approved media representatives, had somehow gained access to the reception and was taking unauthorized pictures of guests. Security moved quickly to intercept the intruder, but not before he had captured several frames. The incident caused a stir among the guests, many of whom were uncomfortable with unexpected media attention. "I do apologize for the disruption," Charles told Lord Morrison, who was looking distinctly annoyed by the breach of privacy. "Not your fault, Your Majesty. These things happen. Though I must say, the security arrangements seemed rather lax this evening." Charles was about to respond when he saw Kate approaching. She had clearly witnessed the photographer incident and looked concerned about its impact on the evening's fundraising efforts. "Lord Morrison," she said with a warm smile, "I hope this interruption won't affect your generous support for the program. The children we'll be helping are counting on donors like you." "Of course not, Your Royal Highness. Though I do hope the hospital will review their security protocols for future events." Kate nodded graciously. "I'm sure they will. Your Majesty, might I have a word with you about the implementation timeline?" It was a perfectly reasonable request, the kind of coordination between senior royals that happened regularly at charitable events. But Charles felt his pulse quicken at the prospect of speaking with Kate privately. "Of course," he said. They excused themselves from Lord Morrison and moved toward a quieter corner of the reception room. Other guests were scattered throughout the space, but this particular area offered relative privacy for their conversation. "That photographer could be a problem," Kate said quietly once they were alone. "If he captured anything compromising from earlier this evening." Charles realized she was right to be concerned. They had been careful throughout the evening to maintain appropriate distance, but there had been moments when she finished her speech and their eyes met across the room, when he had smiled with obvious pride during her presentation. That could be misconstrued by someone looking for a story. "I'm sure security confiscated his camera," Charles said. "And even if they didn't, there was nothing inappropriate in our behavior tonight." Kate nodded, but he could see the worry in her eyes. The constant vigilance required to hide their feelings was taking a toll on both of them. "Catherine," he said softly, using her name despite the public setting. She looked up at him, and for a moment her careful composure slipped. In her expression, he could see all the longing and frustration she had been hiding for weeks. "I can't keep doing this," she whispered. "Pretending that you don't matter to me, that I don't think about our conversations constantly, that I don't." She stopped herself before finishing the sentence, but Charles knew what she had been about to say. "I know," he replied, his voice equally quiet. "I feel the same way." They were standing closer now than they should have been, drawn together by the magnetic pull that had been building between them for months. Charles was acutely aware of Kate's presence, the way the light from the chandeliers brought out the auburn highlights in her dark hair, the subtle scent of her perfume, the rise and fall of her breathing. "What are we going to do?" Kate asked, echoing the question that had been haunting both of them. Before Charles could answer, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Papa? Catherine? Is everything all right?" They turned to find William approaching, his expression concerned but not yet suspicious. He looked elegant in his evening wear, every inch the future king he had been born to be. "We were just discussing the security breach," Charles said smoothly, while Kate stepped back to create more appropriate distance between them. "Ah yes, quite concerning," William agreed. "I spoke with the security team. They did confiscate the photographer's equipment, and He's been escorted from the premises. Apparently, he was a freelancer hoping to sell pictures to one of the tabloids. That's a relief, Kate said. But Charles could hear the strain in her voice. William moved to stand beside his wife, his hand coming to rest naturally on the small of her back. It was an unconscious gesture of ownership and protection that Charles had seen hundreds of times before, but tonight it felt like a knife twisting in his chest. You were brilliant tonight, darling, William told Kate with obvious pride. The speech was perfect, and I think we'll exceed our fundraising targets because of your presentation. Kate smiled up at her husband with genuine warmth. It's such an important cause. I just hope we can make a real difference for those children. Watching them together, seeing the easy intimacy and shared purpose that had always characterized their relationship, Charles felt the full weight of what his feelings for Kate could destroy. William clearly adored his wife, trusted her completely, and had no idea that his own father posed a threat to their marriage. Well, William continued, we should probably make our rounds and thank some of the major donors. Lord Morrison was particularly generous tonight. Of course, Kate agreed. She turned to Charles with a polite smile that gave no hint of their earlier conversation. Thank you for your support this evening, Your Majesty. The hospital is fortunate to have your patronage. The pleasure was entirely mine, Charles replied formally. Your work with children's charities continues to be exemplary. William beamed at what he perceived as his father's approval of his wife's efforts. She really is remarkable, isn't she? I'm constantly amazed by her dedication. As the couple moved away to continue their networking, Charles remained in the corner where they had left him, feeling more alone than he had in years. The contrast between their easy partnership and his own isolation was stark and painful. For the rest of the evening, Charles maintained perfect royal protocol. He spoke with donors, praised the hospital's work, and showed appropriate appreciation for Kate's speech without any hint of personal interest. When photographers captured him applauding her efforts or engaging with other guests, the images would show nothing more than a supportive father-in-law and dedicated monarch. But, internally, he was at war with himself. Every instinct told him to find a way to be alone with Kate again, to continue their conversation and explore the feelings they had both acknowledged. At the same time, his rational mind recognized that pursuing those feelings would inevitably destroy the people he loved most. The breaking point came as the evening was winding down. Charles was saying goodbye to the hospital's board members when he overheard a conversation between two society reporters who had been covering the event. Did you see the way the king looked at the Princess of Wales during her speech? One of them was saying. There was something almost intense about his attention. Oh, you're imagining things, the other replied. He was just being supportive. Though I must say, she really has grown into the role beautifully. William is lucky to have her. Indeed he is. She's everything Diana was, but with better judgment about men. The casual comparison to Diana hit Charles like a physical blow. Here were strangers discussing the parallels he had been struggling with privately, making observations about his behavior that could easily become gossip or worse. If outside observers were beginning to notice his attention to Kate, how long would it be before someone with a more suspicious mind put together a story? How long before William himself began to question the dynamic between his father and his wife? Charles excused himself from the conversation and made his way to the hotel's lobby, where his security team was waiting to escort him home. As his car pulled away from the Dorchester, he made a decision that felt both necessary and devastating. He couldn't continue this dangerous dance with Kate. For the sake of everyone involved, William, the children, Camilla, the monarchy itself, he would have to find the strength to step back from whatever was developing between them. The alternative was too destructive to contemplate. But even as he resolved to maintain distance from Kate going forward, Charles knew that tonight had changed something fundamental. The way she had looked at him when she said she couldn't keep pretending, the vulnerability in her voice when she asked what they were going to do, those moments had revealed a depth of feeling that couldn't simply be willed away. He was in love with his son's wife, and she was in love with him. That truth would color every family gathering, every public appearance, every moment they were forced to be in the same room for the rest of their lives. The only question now was whether they could find the strength to resist acting on those feelings, or whether the secret that was burning between them would eventually consume everything they had worked to protect. As his car navigated the quiet London streets, Charles stared out at the city he was sworn to serve and wondered if he was strong enough to choose duty over desire one more time. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier, and he was no longer certain he possessed the strength to bear it without breaking under the pressure. In a few hours, he would return to Clarence's house and lie beside Camilla, pretending that everything was normal while his mind replayed every moment of his conversation with Kate. Tomorrow, there would be more engagements, more obligations, more opportunities to demonstrate that he was the stable, dependable monarch his people needed. But, tonight, driving through the darkness toward an uncertain future, Charles allowed himself to acknowledge the truth he had been fighting for months. He had fallen completely, irrevocably in love with the one woman he could never have. And that love was about to test every principle he had ever held dear.